anger always comes from a place of some variation of a hurt. Hurt can only come from something that I love and care about, whether it's the hurt of losing someone or the hurt of my values being conflicted that I care about. So anger actually comes from love and care. So there's a healthy level of boredom, because boredom is where we used to actually catch up with what's going on with us emotionally. Whereas we're so busy now, we don't get time to do that. So if I'm stuck in a rip or a current off the ocean, off the beach, me worrying about what I'm going to be eating that night or what I'm doing next week is literally a waste of time. My whole job right now is to keep my head above water. That's all I'm focused on. So that's sometimes that I always use that as an analogy just to keep in mind. And that's that survival mindset.
Hey, and welcome back to another episode of Good Grief. Today I've got a special guest with me, and sitting beside me is Shaun Prentis. He happens to be my psychologist, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for a number of weeks now. Shaun and I got connected, I believe, thanks to my mum, who referred me to Shaun. Not that she was getting sessions with Shaun, but she'd heard about him and happened to be local. I was looking for a psychologist that not only knew what they were talking about. Shaun's been practicing psychology and counseling and in the mental health space for over 20 years now, but then also somebody who knew God and had a spiritual aspect and faith to what they do, so that I could reconcile both mind and spirit in the sessions that we took on. For those who know my story, you would know that my dad died 11 years ago in a plane crash, and that is really the pillar of my grief. Although I've lost many people over the years, family, friends, other friends in plane crashes. I'm off to a funeral in 2 days' time for another friend. But my grief was triggered again 11 years later last year when our family pet, not even my pet, but my brother's dog, died. And I started going into the depths of anxiety, depression, overwhelm, brain fog. And so I needed someone to chat that out with and to understand what was happening in my brain. And so today we're going to be talking about how grief affects the brain. So Shaun, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you here.
Nice to catch up again.
And we were just saying that usually you're the one waiting for me to arrive for a session.
Bit weird sitting on this side, but all good.
The roles have reversed. So today I'm going to ask the questions and we'll see where it takes us. But
all good.
I want to dive straight in.
Yeah, that sounds good.
I want to know from yourself personally, how do you think about grief and loss?
I think, look, there's the standard sort of thinking with grief where it's the loss of someone or something that we love. And I think one of the big things I always sort of add to that, though, is also it's the loss of someone or something we love, but also the loss of the future hope that we have with it. I think that's a really big part that comes into the grief part of the process. And so you've got those two sides of things. I mean, people always hear about the stages of grief and all the different emotions that you have. And like I think it's Kubler-Ross's model that talks through that. But one of the models that sort of makes the most sense to me is more this what they call the dual processing model. And it's this idea where you've basically got just work through and basically deal with the emotions of the loss and the acceptance of the loss and working through that process, as well as the loss of the future hope that you had with that person. And at the same time, while you're doing that, you've also got the next stage where you're working through and trying to learn to move forward without that person or thing in your life in the same capacity. Now, when I say that, because it's especially coming from a Christian perspective as well. Yes, we lose someone, but it's not that we may lose them in a physical capacity where they're with us, but they're always in our hearts and minds. So it's that moving forward in a different context. So you've got those kind of things going on at the same time, but it's obviously, and I suppose that's one of the first things I want to also just, as we're talking, just talk through. It's everything I'm saying is looking at a more broader perspective. Obviously, when we caught up, you're able to use the stuff and do it individually. It's very specific. And I think for everyone who's listening, it's also, that's the important part. It's everything I say today is going to be potentially more generic. It's not something that applies directly, specifically to each situation.
It's good to put that disclaimer out there, because our audience, as we've chatted, have lost everyone and everything. Yeah. And, we can't cover that in a 60, 90-minute conversation. But what I'm excited for is some of the ideas that, when we sat together, I would take all these notes and come back to Kaylee and just go, she'd say, how was the session? I'd say, unbelievable, because there were ideas, even though specific to me, there were still some broad concepts. And so I want to look at unpacking some of those and some of the tools that you've got today. You've mentioned to me that a large percentage of your clients would suffer with grief, but mostly unbeknowingly, they're dealing,
Yes.
they come to you with a problem, and you sort of unpack things and find that there's quite often grief underlying. How do you see that play out in their lives?
Definitely. I see it happens all the time. Particularly, I often have clients where they're basically being diagnosed with depression on antidepressants for 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
Sure.
And then you start talking through things, and then I hear that, like even in your case, like I lost a parent, or I lost it, and I've had clients where they've lost both parents within 4 or 5 years.
Yeah,
And it's this idea. I think one of the hard parts where we get stuck with sometimes, because then people sort of diagnose it as depression, where it's actually not depression, it's grief.
right.
Obviously, the symptoms look the same, and there's an overlap in those spaces. But when you're sort of looking at that idea of actually dealing with the grief and processing the grief, and I think the thing with grief is it's the loss of someone or something,
Yeah,
and it covers so many different areas that we're not aware of.
totally.
And I think we tend to have that more standardized view of grief as the loss of someone, and that's where I think a lot of people get stuck, because it can be. Retirement is a huge area. People don't realize they're going through grief, loss of job,
right. Loss of relationship,
emptiness syndrome. All those sort of spaces, those big life changes,
Sure.
that's all sort of spaces where we end up having grief as well.
Sure.
And having to process the loss of what we've had before. So,
okay. And so, when I came to you, I thought it was, depression and anxiety. Well, they were the symptoms that were coming out. It's hard to get out of bed all of a sudden. I didn't want to work, and all of those things were coming out of me. But you helped me understand, and I shared that my brother's dog had died tragically. It was a puppy, a routine operation, and died on the operating table. But you helped me connect some of those pieces in my brain. And so I'd love to know from the brain side of things. You shared with me and helped me learn a lot about the right and the left side of the brain. Can you just unpack some of that?
yeah. So there's the standardized sort of version of the sort of common idea around where the left side of the brain does the more rational, logical, problem-solving sort of side of thinking, and then the right side is more the creative, intuitive aspect.
Yeah.
Now, there's also, over the years, there's a lot of more researchers come through where they're realizing that they work together. There's a lot more lateralization between the two. But they are basically, like the way I try to keep it, there's obviously the more psychological side of things, but I try to keep it more simple. The idea of my sort of rational, logical side of the thought process brain, and then my emotions. And I sort of describe like the right side as almost like my maths brain.
Sure.
1 + 1 = 2, black and white, sequencing, prioritizing, and loves to fix things. And then you've got emotions, which is like art, where I can have 6 or 7 emotions at the same time, and it all makes sense in that space. Now, the rational, logical brain does not like that. It doesn't make sense. And very much it links in with all how we sort of also just operate in life, because we tend to think of life as life's meant to be good. We're meant to be normal. And I think that's one of the biggest misnomers that I find with grief. We sort of go, well, this is not normal that I'm feeling this way. Where it's exactly how I'm meant to be feeling when I've lost something that's important to me.
And that's the mathematical side of the brain.
The mathematical side is trying to fix something that it doesn't understand.
The equation should work out.
Yes.
And that's what I resonated with so much. And that's maybe more so my personality and character, where I've got a creative side, but I'm very logical in that aspect. I write lists, I plan for things. And so 1 + 1 should always equal 2.
Yeah.
But in my situation, it wasn't working out like that. Why was I getting 7?
Yes. And it's this idea that we sort of almost like when we lose someone, it's okay, we sort of understand we've got to go through grief, but it's this idea of trying to get through it almost as quickly as we can and getting back to normal.
Sure.
And we often define normal as how it was before I lost the person, which that's not going to be how it goes going forward. It's going to be different.
You said we often think of normal as going back to how it was before we lost the person. So what you're saying is there are different forms of normal, or are you saying that there really is no normal? But
it's going to have to evolve. I've lost someone, whether like in your case, you've lost a parent.
Yeah.
It was never going to be back to normal
Nothing
again.
That you could say,
No.
nothing that I could do.
It's not that's going to be a new normal, and that's the process of working through accepting the loss, but also that process of accepting what does the future look like in a different way.
It's big stuff.
Yeah.
It's big stuff. You said there that you find often people try to get this grief thing done quickly.
Yes. Well, look, we all know emotions they're not comfortable. If people were comfortable with emotions, I wouldn't have a job.
Yeah, that's right.
So emotions aren't comfortable. We don't like dealing with them. And the other part with it also, the way I try to describe it is these two processes going on. So there's dealing with the emotions, and then there's this learning to move forward with the process at the same time, like what my new future looks like. Now, I try to think of them attached by a massive elastic band.
Okay.
Often my emotions are going to be so extreme that I just can't move forward. They're stopping me from actually being able to move forward. But on the other side, quite often what happens is I can start moving forward, but then somewhere along the line, if I don't process those emotions well, they're going to come back and get me from behind later on, which I think was your sort of experience with the loss of the puppy.
Yeah. So I love that picture of the elastic band because I can see how that works. We all know how elastic bands work.
Yeah.
And they can work for you or they can work against you.
Yeah. And it's this whole idea of basically with grief trying to do these two processes to get almost like a step by step, like left, right. I always sort of have the idea of doing left foot, right foot.
Yep.
So I've got to feel the emotions, process the emotions, and then also start moving forward. But then often what happens is as you move forward, you're going to have like those anniversary moments and the sort of, and that we often try to avoid those, and they're actually really important part of the process because they bring up other emotions that I have to process. And so it's working these two in tandem together.
I want to go back to the mathematical and creative side, art side. You said that like half the brain is trying to make an equation, the other half's dealing in colors and pictures and so forth. And then you also said that we don't like feeling emotions. So how can it be that when we fall in love, for example, it's the best feeling?
I think I'll probably, just as you said that, I probably need to we don't like feeling negative emotions.
And they overpower.
And they overpower. And it's almost like we have this idea that life is meant to go relatively well. So even though we know that it doesn't, so even rationally, our rational brain understands that it doesn't go well. But just with having that underlying belief system, I tend to find that we've got this idea that, okay, so when bad things do happen, we need to try fix them and get through them as quickly as we can to get back to being good.
Sure.
And that's often the underlying part that causes a lot of this with that right brain trying to sort of drive that. Because in our day-to-day life, that's the part of the brain that does a lot of what we do. So just like in terms of getting the kids to school and running chores and doing all and our work, we use that part of the brain all the time. So it likes being in control and sort of driving things, and that's where we get stuck with this process sometimes.
And grief is when we're often the most out of control we'll ever feel.
That's the biggest thing with loss. It highlights that we're not in control.
And so going then to the creative art side, we're not in control. So the side that's logical and rational is not in control. We're in the side where there's multiple emotions at once. How then can we lean into that space? Because it's different for everybody. So how can we lean into those emotions of maybe sadness, anger, depression? Because they are there for us. It's not that, and this has been a learning I've had, that anger isn't a bad emotion.
Not at all.
And I have anger in my personality, which is a trait, which can really fuel me. But if I use it wrongly, it can also lead to sin and all sorts of other things. So how can we lean into the emotions during grief, the ones that are painful, that don't feel like we're moving forward, that we feel like maybe, you can't get up out of bed, those types of emotions. How can we lean into them in a healthy way?
I think it's like just touching on what you're saying, like with anger, for example. Like, I mean, anger, if you, like, there's lots of much broader perspectives, but ultimately, if you sort of really sort of keep it simplified, anger always comes from a place of some variation of a hurt. Hurt can only come from something that I love and care about, whether it's the hurt of losing someone or the hurt of my values being conflicted that I care about. So anger actually comes from love and care.
Oh, that's huge.
And even when you often look at it, even from a scriptural perspective, often people sort of struggle with the wrathful God in the Old Testament. But it's because the people he loved were hurting themselves. It was still coming from something that he cares about.
Wow.
Because if we're not generally, if we don't care, we're not going to get angry. We're not going to feel. And I think that's one of the big things with grief, is realizing that these feelings are meant to reflect how much this person meant to me.
I think that's a huge unlock right there, because even for me right now, I mean, I'm in therapy right now, just like understanding this. It's that anger. That's not where the buck stops.
No.
If we go back a step further, it's because we've loved someone or something that we're angry.
Yes.
About.
And
Wow.
that's the difference between like our fixing brain loves the anger, because anger is one of the few emotions that feels like we're fixing something.
Sure.
But it's often not understanding why it's the why we're really angry. What have we lost? Why do we care?
This is huge. So we're talking about the brain. One of the most common phrases, but also questions that we've received from our audience, things that I've said before, is like grief brain. You know, there's baby brain.
Yep.
We're going through a little bit of baby brain at the moment and forget things and where was that. But grief brain, brain fog, even grief amnesia. Yeah, can you just touch on those?
Yeah.
Where does that idea come from? Is that a scientific idea or outworking in our brain?
Look, there's a lot of research around it. I think one of the big things to clarify with brain fog is brain fog comes across in lots of different areas. So basically, stress, there's lots of different areas where people will experience brain fog. There's also medical conditions that can cause brain fog. But like in the terms of the context of what we're talking about here, grief brain fog, it's what happens. We've also got to understand with grief, especially when it's a traumatic sort of loss, it's going to trigger a stress response in the body, and the stress response is often going to cause the fight and flight symptoms to sort of kick into place. It's also going to, quite often, depending on the nature of the grief, it's also going to be quite traumatic. So the body's going to basically almost try to survive. And the brain fog is one of those things that it'll start doing, purely because it's. And one of the hard parts with this also is to keep in mind, we're going along our life and suddenly we lose one of the most important things in our life. It changes perspective, and suddenly our body is trying to process those emotions and deal with that, worrying about where my keys are. The brain's not focused on it at the moment.
Not high on the priority list.
It's not high on the priority list. And this is the hard part. That's how it's meant to be.
So it's a protective mechanism.
It's a protective mechanism. And so you can often go into the survival space. And obviously, it's incredibly frustrating when you're trying to get on with life and that moving forward part.
Totally.
And what tends to happen, which makes it even worse quite often, is we start noticing it, because I have clients all the time in different contexts coming in, I'm losing my memory, my concentration's gone. And that starts creating a fear and anxiety that there's something wrong with me.
But it's the body taking its natural course.
It's a natural course. The body's doing a natural course. There was a workshop I was in a few years ago, and they did this sort of like basically a demonstration role play as an example. And they had two people in the group basically doing a mock sort of just interview.
Sure.
But the one person, they had 4 or 5 people just with rolled up magazines, just whispering small comments in their ears as they were doing the interview, just to get them for us to be able to see the experience of what it's like when you have multiple voices going on. And obviously we look at it from like a schizophrenia, of those kind of spaces. But the thing with this is when we're stressed, when we're processing stuff, our brain is it's basically like having other conversations going on in our head at the same time. If I'm having a conversation going on, I'm worrying about something else, or I might be putting my keys somewhere while I'm worrying about this, and that's why I don't know where I put them.
This is making so much sense. So that exercise would be like us right now, having someone with a magazine rolled up, whispering in our ear, and we're trying to have this conversation. That's what it feels like. That's honestly what it feels like. Wow. And then it makes it hard to do the smallest tasks.
Yeah, and
let alone surviving.
Absolutely.
Like, we've got to work. We've got to put food on the table. We've got to take care of little ones and family members maybe that aren't healthy because of a loss, and a million and one things.
And this is where our fixing brain comes into play and starts going, I can't have space for these emotions. They're getting in the way. I need to shut them. I've got to get going doing all of those things. I've got to put food on the table. And it starts and that's where the gap between the emotions and the moving forward, elastic band starts coming into play.
Right. And I mean, hey, I'll put my hand up first to say, I squashed emotions, and I know so many of our audience the same thing. I'll suppress that, get on with things here. Or it depends on the role that you had. So our friends just recently who have lost their brother, husband and wife, it's the wife's brother who passed. So she's very deep dealing with that. And her husband is doing all the organising.
Yes.
Because someone's got to organise the funeral and this is coming and this is going and taking the calls. And so, that was me in our family scenario, taking care of mum. And I stood up to be that person. And so I was grateful for a community around me. I was grateful to process it through the music we were writing. But still over the years, there's stuff unpacking and uncovered that I suppressed because I was just doing all the rational, logical things.
You've raised a really good point, because it's not always that we don't want to be dealing with emotions, but often life necessitates that I've got to move on and keep moving on, because other things happen and we've got to get in the way there. But that's the idea, is like, if I am that person who's basically having to look after everyone's support, it's knowing that I need to create the space and time to actually deal with my emotions. Otherwise, that elastic band idea sort of starts playing in.
So what about, just going further on this, one of our followers, Karen, asked, about grief, amnesia, or brain fog.
Yeah.
She said, I've got no recollection of about 6 weeks from the day of my husband's funeral. So what about that memory loss or total blackout, so to speak?
Look, there's different things that could be going on there at a more specific level.
For sure.
But one of the broader concepts that I always sort of try to go is, I may not remember chronological things that were happening or practical things that were happening, but I can remember exactly how I was feeling in that space. My emotions are basically taking over. They're front and center, and everything else is happening, but I'm not necessarily aware of it.
Sure.
And obviously, very traumatic sort of experiences as well. It's a bit like PTSD. There's going to be that trauma response that will come into play.
Sure.
And that's very much the protective, because the body's got to try and get the right balance between, the body knows it needs to process, but it also knows that when it's too much to process at the same time. So it's trying to get this balance right and help protect you.
Sure.
And sometimes it may be a space of going, I just need to block things for a while before we can get to the space to do it.
You know what? I think one of the hardest things about grief is there's no timeline to it. It's how long is a piece of string.
Yeah.
You question, when will I be through this? When will I be able to move forward? But for some people, it's, the next week. Some people, it's the next year. Sometimes it's 10 years down the track. And then in my case, in many people's cases, there are things that trigger those emotions and responses. So to take everyone on the podcast back, Dad died 2012. 10 years later, this is last year, 2023. My brother has this pet corgi, most beautiful corgi ever, just going for a regular D-sex, operation, if that's the right term, and complication and bled out, unfortunately over the next 24 hours, with the doctor. And so we lost her. And I've never had a dog. And so I've never understood people that have lost pets. But after losing her, she wasn't even my dog, but I loved her like a family member. And so speaking with you, there was an analogy that you gave me that I just found one of the most practical, helpful ideas of understanding the two sides of the brain. Because I said, obviously my dad, for me, is a far greater loss than our puppy or my brother's puppy. Why am I feeling such similar emotions, and why is this bringing up so much stuff? And you said to me, I don't know if you remember this or not.
I was just thinking,
what did you say? This is a year ago now.
This is going to come back on me now.
Well, you can confirm if you still believe it or not. You said to me, yes, your dad is a greater loss to you than a puppy, but the way your brain sees it is, it sees your dad as this semi-trailer moving through time and space, and it sees the puppy as a motorbike moving through time and space. But the brain doesn't see the vehicle. It just sees that both vehicles are yellow.
Yes. And the yellow is the emotion. Yeah.
Oh, I get goosebumps now thinking about that. It made so much sense to me. It wasn't about the size of the loss. It was loss itself.
And this is where we get confused, because our rational brain's going, but dad, puppy, like why is it affecting me? But the emotions, the art is going, it's loss.
We're just throwing paint at a canvas.
And and even in that space, as we're talking now, not only because there's different emotions that come, and this is an example where the emotions, there can be different emotions. Like obviously there's the loss part,
Yeah.
but also in both instances there was a shock.
It's a tragedy. That's right, tragedy.
It was the suddenness. So just that feeling, that suddenness, loss of control.
Yeah. And seeing my mum go through a similar, and my brother going through those similar emotions as well. It's like looking in the mirror and going, we're doing this all over again.
And it's funny because, I mean, it's weird as a psychologist when people talk like and saying, oh, triggers, but we often see like anniversary.
Is that weird, is it? Is using that term?
No, because everyone does, but it's weird
Sure.
as a psychologist going, oh, I don't really, because for me, having an anniversary moment or having something bring up emotion, yes, it's going to trigger things, but we tend to see triggers as a bad thing that I need to fix, as opposed to this is part of the process. This is highlighting how much the person actually, the impact they've had in my life, how much they mean to me. It's almost like sometimes can diminish the value that they have. It's not, it's our fixing brain going, we need to try and not feel these things as opposed to, but no, I want to feel these things if this person meant that much to me.
So very similar to what we were saying about anger, that the trigger isn't where it stops. It's actually you're feeling triggered, quote unquote, because of the love, the relationship, everything that
it's part of the process of actually going, this is the loss. And there's a similar sort of, I mean, it's a different topic, but the similar sort of idea of even forgiveness. We lose sight of the fact that like forgiveness is I have to forgive, or because it's the same sort of concept here. I have to forgive, but sometimes I don't realize like forgiveness is almost like paying the debt. There's this concept of I have to sort of absorb the hurt there. But sometimes it might be a year, 2 years later before I realize actually how much there was actually involved in that. And that's the same thing with grief. We processing the loss, and this is why those future moments come in, because say, for example, like I know, like I've had clients over the past where they've lost a parent, in your case as well, and you're going, okay, well, my parents are never going to be, they're not going to see me at my wedding.
Oh, so many of those thoughts. Yeah.
That's one of those realizations. As that moment comes, we see it as a trigger. It's like, oh, I'm getting triggered here. But it's one of those realizations of the loss that I've actually had with, because that's the future part, what I've lost in the future with them.
Sure. So we could potentially, what you're saying is we should think about reframing that idea of getting triggered or triggers in our world. Because when you do hear, even if I've said it or I've heard somebody say it, it's like, oh, that's really triggering. It sounds like it's got a negative connotation.
Yes.
If we ask why is that triggering?
Yeah.
Well, because I love them. I miss them so much. They meant so much to me. I wish they were here still every day.
Yeah. And I mean, like when you're getting married and your parents aren't with you, there's a bittersweet sadness.
So there's anniversaries, there's weddings, there's birthdays, there's Christmases, there's all of those moments that we can look to.
It's your parents not seeing you
so it's that
as
future.
A parent. You just said
that's right. Yes, which we haven't worked through just yet. We're working through that one.
Sorry to bring that one up.
No. It's been crazy actually on that topic. We've just had 2 weeks, like I said, since 2 weeks tomorrow since Nazare was born, and we haven't yet stepped into trying to process that just yet. The joy and the love has just been so overwhelming. We've still got my mum here and Kaylee's dad here, and so that's still just been beautiful. And I asked Kaylee, I don't know what day it is right now. I asked her in the last 2 weeks, I said, have you thought about just yet your mum and how she'd be right here? And have I thought about dad? And Kelly said, oh, not really just yet. We haven't stepped into feeling what that loss is going to be like.
And that's probably a really good example of this process of where you guys at the moment, you're in that space of moving forward, which you're meant to be. But there's going to be a time where we've also going to want to sort of process that too.
And that's the thing, we're fully aware of moving forward. Obviously, we've started Good Grief, right? We're just hanging out in this space. And so we know the goal is moving forward. We know the goal is hope and peace. However, we also know that there's tears and heartache mixed in with that. I asked a question in our Facebook group last week. I said, do you believe joy and grief can coexist? And man, we got some just incredible answers. And it was quite, what's the right word for this? It was quite, it inspired a lot of hope to see the majority of people say yes.
Yes.
We can experience joy and grief together, and sharing examples where they have had that. You know, on my birthday when my wife wasn't here to celebrate that, my kids built something incredible, to celebrate her. And as much as it was painful, there was so much joy in that as well.
Yes. Yeah. And it's funny, I had an experience not long ago. I was just some personal stuff that I was going through at the time. I was walking along Burley, just processing stuff. And actually had my sunglasses on, in tears. But while I was walking, there's a young girl, she must have been in like mid-30s, walking her young puppy in front of me, but her puppy was dragging behind. And the wind was blowing, these leaves were blowing across the path. And this puppy was basically almost like side Pac-Manning on the path trying to catch these leaves.
Yeah.
I'm in tears, laughing my head off at this dog. And and I suppose that's one of the biggest things I sort of try to encourage people. It's that idea, this belief idea that life should be good. We tend to sort of put it into a more linear get back to good.
Yeah.
When like one of the best ways I've heard it described probably about a year ago is, if you see life as like a bicycle where there's the good wheel and the bad wheel and they're both rolling on the ground at the same time. And when you start seeing because then different emotions, positive and negative, can coexist at the same time.
Whoa, that's powerful.
And many cultures actually believe that. It's Western culture is probably one of the few that sort of has this more idea of life is meant to be better or meant to be good more times than not.
And to take that analogy one step further, we're the ones riding the bike. So we can either be stationary and stop, but we're still going to have both of those
great way,
emotions, or we can be riding.
I'll be using that feature.
I love bikes, so it just makes sense to me.
Yeah, but it's absolutely,
Okay, so we've talked about sort of that grief brain. We've talked about the right and the left and some triggers. I'd love to know for yourself, and we've been talking about this, but like, what are some of the coping exercises or things practically that we can lean into?
Look, as far as obviously, like especially when you're talking about like the brain fog, like the grief brain and that kind of thing, relaxation, like the research shows, relaxation, meditation, journaling.
What is it about those things?
Well, they all basically start trying to get back into the present. And also, funny enough, like journaling is quite often going to start tapping more into the emotions. But one of the biggest things are sort of, with all of those, and like all the research shows this as well, but one of the things I always highlight, because our rational brain will go to, if I do this, great, I'll just do these things and I'll be fine. But they won't work if I don't actually also create space to feel the emotions and deal with the emotions, because that will then gradually start building up, and the body has to sort of resolve itself. We often see depressive symptoms as a bad thing, but quite often that's the body's way of basically saying, you're not dealing with this, we need to deal with this, we need to get back into balance.
So it's more of a signal.
It's a signal quite often. It can be used quite often as a signal. And that's probably one of the biggest things where I go, like I encourage most people. And it's funny, I obviously with grief I use this, but I use this in all the different contexts. I encourage people to very much create almost like a space, I call it like a flexible diary.
Okay.
Where I create space, like whether it's once a week, once a fortnight, whatever it is, where I'm actually just going and giving myself 2-3 hours where I can just sit with my emotions. And like I know for myself, I do it probably twice a week. Another way I often call it like going to like emotional gym. I'm basically spending time just going, okay, what's going on with my emotions, where they're at. Now, obviously, if I'm going through grief, there's a lot of them. So like for me, I tend to increase that more.
Sure, yeah. Open the diary up a little bit more.
I make more space. One of the biggest things with it, the reason I say flexible diary is because if I'm saying, okay, Friday mornings is my morning and I wake up and it's the best I've felt in 6 months, it's probably not the best time to do it.
Go for a run.
It's, okay, I'll do it and I can have some flexibility around that.
Yeah.
But the idea of this is by doing that regularly and becoming where I'm just doing that at a regular basis, it's the body starts learning to trust that you are dealing with your emotions, which does tend to sort of over time, once the trust starts building,
Right.
the body will start going, or the rational brain will go, okay, you aren't ignoring this. You've got it covered. I don't have to keep throwing these things up randomly all the time. So you do start getting a bit more space to sort of work back. That idea of I got my time to feel, now I can actually do stuff.
So I love the idea of the flexible diary. I think that's fantastic. And what you're saying there is the mind and the body are sort of, they get out of sorts somewhat when grief strikes us. And it's about building trust again between the two.
Yeah. And because it's this really weird thing where at some level the rational brain doesn't like dealing with emotions, but it knows. It's actually it's a bit like my daughter going to school this morning. Doesn't want to go to school, but knows she has to.
There you go. Yeah.
And it's the same sort of idea. Mm-hmm. The rational brain knows that we do need to deal with this, and it will start panicking when we don't. But at the same time, and that's why it's having that space where it can actually just deal with my emotions. And then, so for me, it's like walking along Burley. I listen to like other worship music. Sometimes don't listen to anything.
Big fan of going for a walk.
Yeah. It's because even like having a space where I can go to and that, my body starts gradually getting an idea, okay, this is that space where I do that.
Sure.
Like another one, funny enough, a lot of people, for me, I've definitely noticed it, but a lot of people, like clients over the years, is driving seems to bring up emotions. That's often where my emotions will pop up. And I suppose the idea with that is if they do pop up somewhere, it's okay. Because funny enough, I often have it driving to work where I'm about to see 7, 8 clients. It's probably not the best time to have my own emotions playing up. So in that space, it's okay. It's almost like a quick space of, okay, what's going on? Oh, okay, I need to have a think about that. I'm going to the beach tomorrow or the next day. I'll do it then.
Right. So you post-it note.
It's almost like post-it notes. And once the big thing is coming back to it.
Sure.
Because once I start doing it and the body trusts it, and we know, because there's going to be times when you do it and there's nothing there, and that's okay. But if you know you're going the next week, it'll come up then, and that process starts building the trust.
I think you're touching on something pretty powerful that like most of us break promises to ourselves more often than we realize, which causes that distrust. But if we build that in, I'm going to deal with this tomorrow, I'll come back to it tonight, and we do, the body starts going, yeah, I trust the way that you're balancing life, and everything else.
And one of the really big things that I find people struggle with this is, because it is, especially in the beginning when we're out in early stages of grief, the emotions are intense.
High. Yeah.
They're very intense. They're high. It's overwhelming. And quite often people have this fear of going, well, if I go in there, I'll never come out. I'll get stuck. Which is a very valid fear, and it's very real.
You've never been there before.
Yes, exactly. I don't know this, and so there's this real fear. So the hard part with this is, as much as I get it and I absolutely sympathize, the other part with it also is what people tend to do is they sort of like almost half go in, and they'll try to do it very, very softly.
Sure.
But the danger that sometimes with that is that extends over a much, much longer period. And it's almost this idea of we going in and we're sort of doing it softly, trying to be in control. But that can often, I've seen it quite often, that's where can lead to depressive symptoms, because we lose sight of the fact with emotions that it starts building the trust in the body. Intense emotions, our body's not usually designed to deal with them intensely for long periods of time. So we tend to bounce out. And this works both ways. We've all been in that thing where we're ecstatically in love, or like even I know when I've been in worship and I'm just, this is amazing. And you can suddenly feel yourself slipping out and you're clinging onto by your fingernails to stay there. And it's like, no. Intense emotions, we do sort of have this process of being able to bounce.
Sure.
And it's, again, the whole idea, because what happens is people are so scared to go in the first time that they don't, and that breaks the trust. Whereas if you can sort of gradually go, yes, I'm doing this, but I'm not doing it now. I'm going to be doing this over a period. Then it loosens that idea of I have to fix, because our fix-it brain says we need to sort this out now because it's hard.
Yeah. As you're talking there, I'm thinking about, we're talking about grief, but we're also talking about love in the same context. And I think when I think about loving my wife and, you know, those early days of dating and all of those emotions. And I think about now, 5 years later, that hasn't been a linear process.
No.
I've had to work on that. Kaylee's had to work on that. And that's easy to understand. When I look back, I go, oh yeah, 5 years. It was intense at the beginning. We wanted to spend every waking moment on the phone. You know, where are you? When can you come around? And then that dips and then it grows and it
evolves.
Evolves, sure.
And I think that's the thing of like this whole comes back to what I was saying right in the beginning. This idea of we've got to fix this and get back to normal. Yes. It's not going back to anything. It's evolving into something new. And
it's taken work.
Yes.
So I can look at that and go, man, we've worked on our relationship. We've worked on our marriage. So then if I flip the coin to grief, if we look at that, okay, that's going to evolve. There's going to be intense periods. There's going to be not so intense periods. But either way, we're going to have to work through it.
Yeah.
We're going to have to put in the work.
I think absolutely. And I think one of the biggest things with grief is also, I mean, look, it's different for everyone in every situation. But it's the idea in the beginning, I'm going to have way more moments of darkness.
Yeah.
With none or very little moments of hope. Mm-hmm. But as we work through the process, and exactly what you're describing in that analogy you're using with marriage, as we start moving forward and feeling and dealing with the emotions, that gradually you start seeing a few more moments of hope, a few more glimmers, and the intensity of the darkness isn't as intense.
Sure.
But it is exactly what you're saying. It actually requires, because it's this idea of almost with emotions, we just got to wait for them to resolve.
That's right.
But using your marriage analogy is a really good example of that. If we waited for the feelings, once we're out of the honeymoon phase, if we wait for the feelings to come back to drive the behaviors, we could be waiting a very long time.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I'm thinking, I'm very visual, and that's why you've been such a great help to me. I'm thinking about like an XY graph. I can't remember which one's X and which one's Y, but the vertical, you know, if that is a level of darkness, you know, as you've said, you start grief on the timeline, you start darkness at ultimate high, and it does dip as time goes on. But I think it's time over work, or work over time is on the bottom of the graph. It's not that people say time heals all wounds, but I disagree with time heals all wounds. I believe God heals all wounds, but I also believe it takes a partnership of working through that as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's again, people have the best of intentions, but I think it's for people who are going through grief, and I've had so many clients over the years, that can be one of the most hurtful things.
Time heals.
Because it's particularly when we're saying time heals and we think or believe that it means like time heals and it'll be back to what it was before.
Yes.
Because time's never going to bring back.
And then how much time?
Yeah. I mean, like for you, losing father, that's not, time's not going to ever heal.
No.
That it was the way before.
Whew. We had a good friend of ours, Dr. Gina Cleo, on the podcast, and she's a habit expert. And she researches how the brain works with forming habits and rewiring the brain. A question that often comes up with our audience is like, how can we rewire the brain? What are some ways that you think about just rewiring some simple things in the daily process? I know we've talked about flexible diary and some of those things. What are some other ways?
Look, I think, like I say, those ideas around with grief it's an interesting sort of dynamic in the space, because creating those habits, and that's why I'm saying even like the flexible diary and like the emotional gym, it's trying to create that as a habit. And because I suppose why I'm sort of raising that one is I often find by doing that one and actually dealing with the emotions, it allows the other habits like exercise,
you know, even cooking,
relaxation, cooking.
Yeah.
And doing those things, I think one of the biggest things where I sort of try to highlight with people is doing things where I can have a break from what I'm feeling, as opposed to avoiding what I'm feeling.
Have a break from what I'm feeling versus avoiding.
Because when I'm trying to avoid what I'm feeling, the brain's almost basically looking to see that we're not feeling that. But as soon as we stop, it's quite often there, and that's why we tend to, instead of watching one episode of Netflix, we end up watching 7 in a night. Or I do anyway.
Yeah, guilty. Yeah.
As opposed to when I'm actually having a break, like the difference with the break is when I'm going, yes, this is heavy. I'm dealing with it in that space, but I just want to have a break from it. The way the brain process can help process, it's that, you know, that idea when we sort of like stuck on a maths problem, we're trying to work something, we're getting frustrated and it's just not going. And then we get distracted, go away, do something else, come back and it suddenly clicks.
Yeah.
When I'm having a break from something, my brain's often processing in the background. And that's what we're trying to sort of also build. And that's why these sort of habits, when I can sort of like cooking, generally things that help me get into the moment, be present. So
for me, cooking's one of those because I don't cook very much. And so I need to read the recipe like 10 times and I can't think about much.
Yes. And it's a project mindset. Like I call it like a project mindset in the zone focus. And things like also even playing with kids.
Sure. Or maybe music.
Yeah. All these kind of things, because it's helping me get into the more present. And like I said, it's the challenges, because like the habits, creating habits are great. But if I'm not dealing it with on the other side as well, what's going to tend to happen, it'll work for a while and then it'll start, the motivation will start dropping and dipping.
So this is very different from sitting with your emotions and journaling, for example. We wouldn't consider journaling a break. That would be actually... No,
that would be one of the...
That's active.
That's an active thing. And that would almost can be a strategy that you're using, is almost like your emotional processing diary kind of it. It can be one of the strategies you could be using there.
Sure. Last night we happened to be watching Stutz. Have you seen that? I can't remember if I brought that up. Yeah, so Jonah Hill, Hollywood, actor, and sits down with his psychologist to film a documentary.
Yes, I've seen the trailer of that.
Yeah, fascinating watch. And Stutz, his psychiatrist, was saying, in terms of journaling, that's where you'll learn the most about yourself, because things come out. And it's such a reminder. It's like, I know that journaling's good for me, but forming that as a habit, much easier said than done.
Yes.
And so maybe attaching that into your, flexible diary absolutely would be. Go for a walk. Is that your space? Sit down and journal in that time, and that's when you know it's going to happen.
And it's absolutely, I think it would be a great idea. One of the things to keep in mind, like I often describe our emotions, like when my daughter was 6 or 7, and she comes home from school, and I can see the tears welling in her eyes, and like, oh, something's going on here. When I say to her, "What's going on?" and if she starts going and I try to stifle that or squash it, or no, you can't feel that, or I'm too busy, I haven't got time for this, that's never going to end well.
No, I can't imagine so. That's all ahead of me.
They're building, yes, it's coming. But if I actually just let her go, and all the emotions come out, most of the time what I have to do at the end, I don't even have to do anything. Or if I do, what I'm going to do at the end is totally different to what I would have done in the front end. I describe our emotions like that child sometimes. Sometimes we just need to be able to give it space to listen to them. And that's where the journaling and that's where that stuff comes in. And one of the things because when I don't know about you, but I know when I was younger, we didn't have all the entertainment. We were bored a lot more.
Sure. Yeah, I was just part of that generation.
Yeah. There's a healthy level of boredom. Because boredom is where we used to actually catch up with what's going on with us emotionally.
Wow.
Whereas we're so busy now, we don't get time to do that.
Boredom's where we used to catch up on what was going on emotionally.
Yeah.
Man, that's huge. That is huge. And we were just mentioning Netflix. I was watching it last night. We've got things at our fingertips, buzzers, notifications that keep us busy and active, and dopamine just filling the brain. Very rarely are we just bored for boredom's sake.
Yeah.
How can we schedule that in? How can we schedule active boredom while grieving?
And it's funny. It's funny that this is where, and this is almost one of the reasons why when we sort of, people talk about that, like the brain fog and the concentration, and I'm not motivated. And it's our body's way of basically trying to go, but we have to actually sit here.
Sure.
We can't just keep going.
So I want to put it out there. It's not a bad thing just to sit and be.
It's going to be part of the process.
It's going to hurt. It's going to be painful. It'll be confusing and overwhelming, but that's part of it. Yeah. It's not moving to the next thing, the next task, the next job.
And it's and as much as as much as we want to, the hard part with that sometimes we're often trying to basically keep ahead of our emotions. We're trying to just keeping busy. We're just ahead of but they're gonna always basically go. They're gonna come catch. They're gonna get us eventually.
Totally. I just think of that rubber band. It's just the rubber band, and I can remember so vividly. Dad died. We had our sort of best immediate friends come over. They looked after us. They actually took care of the business my parents ran, so that was off Mum's hands. And then we had other friends fly up from Melbourne. They stayed with us for a month or so, and they cooked and they cleaned and they just were with us. And we were so grateful for that. But it's a double-edged sword, because then comes time for them to leave, and you become dependent on the house being full of people. There's someone there to listen when you need or to laugh. And then as they leave, you think, what am I going to do with all this time? I can't just be by myself. Yeah. How am I going to process the thoughts without distracting them with something else or somebody else? So that's very interesting you say that.
It's a really big part of, it's part of the process. It's creating space.
And for many people, that can happen, it often happens very quickly. The funeral, the wake, people everywhere, the house is full, and then it just immediately dies off and you're left to pick up the pieces of what's next. And so I think that's where a lot of it's this seesaw. Someone hops off the seesaw and you hit the ground.
Yes. And I think that's always like, even for like people supporting people going through grief, it's always remembering that, because in the front end, like I said, there's meals and everything's coming in and all the support in the front end, but it's the 4, 6, 10 months time. It's the anniversary moments. That's when they're going to need the support.
I love what you said about your daughter, that she would share and your job was just to listen. And I think that's from a supporter's standpoint of someone grieving. You don't have to say anything. No. It's just to be there with them, give them a hug, ask them what you can do.
Yes,
and would be most helpful right now.
Absolutely. And even in that space, sometimes it's being able to recognize seeing someone I love really in pain and hurting makes me uncomfortable. So sometimes me saying things is me trying to fix that discomfort that I'm feeling, as opposed to like where I'm listening. I don't have to fix anything. I just have to listen. And it's funny because like we're talking about all these different balances, like the love and the hurt, but coming from a Christian perspective, I always just laugh, because I mean that's one of the things I love most about Christianity is just these crazy dichotomies that we sit in. Grace and truth.
Yeah, talk to us about, I love this, when we opened up this discussion a few weeks ago. Tell us about the dichotomies. And you mentioned at the start duality. Like, is that a similar thing?
Yes, and this is exactly, it's the dual process of grief. It's really this process. I mean, when you think from a Christian perspective,
let's talk
balancing
on that aspect.
Grace and truth. I'm a sinner but saved. Justice and mercy. That we sit in that space all the time, and where it's these two dichotomies trying to balance each other, like sit and balancing. It's not one stronger than the other. It's getting that balance right. And that's the space that we often it's in this, grief is very much one of those spaces where you really sort of start, probably I think it's one of the biggest areas in our life where we will experience those dichotomies.
One moment laughing, the next moment in tears.
Because that's where often when we suddenly in tears, and then we have a moment, that momentary hope, and that momentary laugh. And so many people I've spoken to there suddenly feel guilt.
Yes, I shouldn't be laughing now.
I shouldn't be laughing now.
I shouldn't be experiencing joy.
But this is where, and that's because we've got that more linear approach as opposed to, this is the dichotomy. And you think of like this is where I would come back to Jesus. He was sad and laughing at the same time.
Totally.
In so many different areas. I'm just thinking of even when he turned water into wine. He's sitting at the wedding in joy, but also being reminded, hold on, I know what this actually means for me.
I even think about Jesus and Lazarus, his good friend.
Yes.
And knowing that he was going to die.
Yeah.
Knowing that he would go to glory where there is no pain, sickness, suffering, but still wept for him. And I often think, was he weeping because his friend died? Or was he weeping because he knew he would bring him back from glory? It's that dichotomy of do we want him here or in heaven ultimately?
Yes.
Which I can't wait
Yeah.
walk through those gates. But it's such a balance. And I can see, I can talk about this all day because my brain just goes, yeah, but I want it to be a straight line. I want to know what's chapter 2 and chapter 3, but we can't.
Yeah.
So, here I was thinking we'd get to all the answers. No, I wasn't. No. I wasn't thinking that at all. But I think for everybody listening, these aspects that we can tangibly take away and think about the elastic band. We can think about the bicycle with the 2 wheels. We can think about the dichotomies of faith and then also grief. Very practical ways. The flexible diary, being, actively bored, all healthy ways of moving forward through grief. I mentioned we put it out to our Good Grief family about they know that you're coming on the show.
Yeah.
And I said, what questions would you like Shaun to answer, my psychologist? and they wrote in and said, tell us all your problems, Ryan. And no, they didn't. But I've got a few here that were really highlighted.
Yep.
So they've been asked by the community, and a lot of people have liked and gone, yep, that's me. So first one here from Ashley. Ashley asked, how can I get my mind and brain to function properly again? And I think we've talked about a lot of that. But in her specific case, that it's almost been 2 years since her husband passed, and she feels like her emotions are not as intense as they were, but the brain fog hasn't lifted yet.
Yeah, and I suppose obviously without knowing the specifics of it, I mean, that's a huge loss. Without knowing whether she's got children, looking what her life looks like now. But that part with there, it's that the indicator there for me is that the emotions are starting to get less, which that's generally for me is a positive sign. But again, I'd probably be trying to sort of go, because we tend to think linear.
Yes.
And we're starting to go on the right track, and we're going to get the part there. I probably would be going is I'm just wandering in that space because the brain fog's part of the process, and I think it's something that it's like all the research you sort of read through this. It's one of those things to expect. Obviously, the bigger the loss, because it's the bigger the loss, and also with the bigger the loss comes the bigger the acceptance and the adjustment to my future.
Yeah, it all compounds.
It's not just the loss. It's all these things all coming together, and in that space, they're all 3 really big ones.
Sure.
So, because even just coming to acceptance of the loss, and because acceptance is probably one of the biggest concepts in here that with grief, that as a human, it's probably one of the toughest concepts as a human that we do. Just having to accept something.
And it's why we still think they're going to walk through the door, or that we pick up the phone and call them by accident and they're not here.
And that's the really hard part with it, is just working through that acceptance, the acceptance of the loss. And that's like I say, there's no, like, how long's a piece of string? But again, I'd probably encourage those ideas of basically trying to I've tended to find that sort of the more I give space to actually feeling my emotions, not trying to get away from them, that starts creating the space for the other things to come in, which then starts reducing the brain fog.
Sure. Kind of off topic here. What are your thoughts on grief groups?
Look, I think they can be really... I think with group dynamics, I always find they can be really positive. There's like anything, there's pros and cons. I think there can be a really positive sort of space where, especially particularly when there's grief groups where it's people going through there's similar sort of understandings. But one of the things I find also, you've always got to remember with grief, coming back to that sort of more Kubler-Ross sort of stages of grief, everyone going through grief has got different emotions going on at different times. And if I've got the anger hitting someone at the moment when there's just full sadness and they are talking together at the same time, that's often where conflict can come into play. And we see it in family dynamics after loss all the time.
Yeah.
One of the things I always sort of go, because you're going to have people with the best of intentions saying really damaging, hurtful things sometimes. And that does happen in grief groups.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
in that space, I sort of go, they can be useful, but also at the same time, being able to go in,
being aware
of that, and being basically, it's something I often say to people, if we could, we can't, but if we could somehow manage to just have 6 to 9 months of absolute grace for everyone in a family when we lose someone, I think 60 to 70% of the conflict would actually not happen. But that's not a space where we can show a lot of grace sometimes, because we're all hurting.
Sure.
But it's just going into grief groups, being very aware of that. And I suppose one of the things I'd sort of just be mindful of is, depending where I'm at in my own process, if I'm really hurting and I haven't got that capacity yet to sort of be able to take some of those things,
might not be the time.
It might not be the time,
or
yeah.
the place.
And I think
Sure.
I think grief groups are definitely, they serve an amazing purpose at the right time.
Yeah. Yeah, because we're talking about two different things, right? You sit with clients one-on-one.
Yeah.
Some people run group sessions. I've personally found it so helpful just to be one-on-one, look in the eye, come with my questions, be able to be completely transparent where I'm at. And I know that doesn't often happen too.
No, and human nature is, we tend to sort of, especially for someone who's they've worked through something's worked for them, and it's coming from the right place. They're going, oh, you should try this.
Totally.
But they're often looking at that person's situation through their context, as opposed to where you can do the one-on-one. It's about my context. So but again, the beauty with groups is you've got other people who are having some level of understanding of what you're going through.
Totally.
And that's really powerful.
Do you want to know, random fact, what one of the most Googled search terms are for grief? Grief counsellor near me.
Oh, geez. I didn't
Worldwide,
know that.
one of the highest searched terms. There you go. Full of fun facts when I need them. Another question here from Natalie. She said, can grief from the suicide of a son manifest as crippling body pain if I have nowhere to express it?
Yes, absolutely. We've got to remember any emotion, grief, particularly with that kind of grief, it's going to, like as I said earlier with the brain fog, it's going to trigger the physiological symptoms, the fight and flight. So emotion can and will manifest in the body if we're not dealing with it. And when I say if we're not dealing with it, it doesn't mean that we might be dealing with it as best we can, but that's why I keep coming back to that. I've actually got to be processing the emotions, because otherwise that's often what I see in my practice is unresolved, undiagnosed grief will manifest in physiological symptoms further down the track. And it basically links into, because of the stress mechanism in our body.
Sure.
So absolutely, it can definitely do that, yeah.
Have you had clients that physically can't get to you because of what they're going through? Like they want to see you, but they can't get out of the front door? Have you had any clients like that? Or
occasionally.
And you do a Zoom call, for example?
I suppose the nature of my current practice, yeah, and I've done that a few times, but in the nature of my current practice, I probably don't see that as much, because it's generally the nature is that clients do get to me.
Sure.
But in my previous role years ago, I would often be going to people and visit them in their houses.
Yeah, crippling anxiety and overwhelm.
Yeah.
Totally.
And even particularly, what I've seen a lot was the really severe depressive symptoms, where there's just the motivation to get out, and there can often be an unresolved grief there linked to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember in our story with Mum, I was like, we got to see a counsellor for this stuff. Like, none of us are prepared for it. You don't learn this stuff in school on how to deal with these sorts of things, and so I really pushed that, and almost like forced us all to go do that. But it was one of the best decisions we made, at that time, and I think it took some time to unpack, or for it to become helpful in a way, like.
Yes.
You've got your guard up,
yeah.
And then eventually you're like, no, this is actually more helpful than my resistance to it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I'd probably just add to that, I think that definitely for me, going to talk to someone to get that individual context, it's so helpful down the line. But one of the big things I would go with that is also being aware of the timing.
I can't remember when it was.
Because
totally.
Something I've seen it's happened to me so many times where, like say, for example, parents have separated and their 13, 14-year-old child, they sort of parents, oh, well, this is going to affect them. So that 14-year-old's sitting in my office and they giving me monosyllables, not mumbling, not giving me much, because they don't know how it's affected them yet. And that's part of the grief, is like they don't know how it's actually impacted them. I see them 12 months later and they know exactly how it's affecting them. And that's where timing can be a really powerful thing, because sometimes if we do it too soon, we don't know the impact yet. And sometimes it may not be seen as, oh, this actually didn't work, which in 12 months' time it could really make it. And it's so productive when it's in the right time.
That's great.
So it's just something I just thought I'd throw out there.
Phenomenal advice, yeah. And I guess you yourself, the person listening right now, only you know that.
Yes.
When you feel like, all right, I've got some things now.
Yeah, and I think generally you're going to find it's yourself, and then those closest around you
will give you a bit
or sometimes might be giving you a bit of a nudge and saying, I think.
Sure. And sometimes that can sound like the harshest love as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they're not apt to deal with that, or to help you through that process.
Yes.
They're there as a friend or a family member, but they're not qualified, or they're,
Yeah.
Or maybe they can't take that emotion on.
And it's like, I think one of the funny is that's actually a really good thing that you raised, because I think one of the times people sort of, even if they want to, and I suppose one of the things I always go, even if they want to and even if they can, sometimes though, by having someone else that you can talk to that's not that, it allows you to keep that relationship the way that relationship's meant to be.
Totally. Yeah, that's great.
And that's something I always just sort of, that's one of the benefits I sort of see of being able to talk to like a psychologist, counselor, is you don't have to blur the boundaries of other relationships.
For sure. Except us, we're here on the couch. Here we are.
It's evolving.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's so cool. A lot of people were very excited for this conversation. All right, I might ask sort of two final questions here from our Good Grief family. Karen here, touching on that grief amnesia, says she's got no recollection of about 6 weeks from the day of her husband's funeral. So, and I know my mum had some real black spots as well there. Yeah, can you speak to that?
Look, again, without speaking to her directly, but
Totally.
What I would guess that may be happening in that space is, as I was saying earlier, there's those two processes. So the one, I'm just dealing with the emotions, and the other one, I'm learning to move forward and try to move on with my life. When those emotions are really, really intense, that could look like that. So I may not be remembering who's visiting and who's around and what's, because I'm just actually trying to process my emotions. And that's, I would hazard a guess that might be something that would have been going on there. It's obviously very disconcerting or very scary. But I mean, that's because again, like in that sort of context, there's also a lot of trauma there.
Yeah.
And I suppose when you're looking at that sort of, when I'm working with clients and you listen to people who've gone through trauma, they often describe that space of not actually being aware of what's going on around them because those emotions are super heightened. And at the same time, so you've got that, and you've also got the survival aspect that possibly your body's coming in, kicking that protective aspect into you, for you.
Yeah, sure. So maybe not the worst thing.
Not necessarily, not at all.
We were talking earlier, and you even said that you're not aware of what's happened, but you are highly aware of the emotions you felt. And so it's not a total...
look, to be honest, both, I suppose where I go, both need to happen. And for my way of thinking, I tend to find the more I can do the emotions earlier, it's going to balance the process quicker. It's not about trying to speed it up or race it through it or but like in that space, for me, it would sound like there's a bit of a combination of dealing more with the emotions, but also just there's the trauma survival aspect the body would have basically created a survival aspect. I suppose an example where I'm going to use this is if I'm stuck in a rip off the beach somewhere.
Now, we have to clarify, is a rip an Aussie term, or
Actually, yeah. We used to, I don't know, because we used to call it, growing up in South Africa, we used to call it a rip as well.
okay, yeah.
So,
Right.
but I don't know if it's just more of a surfing
Sure.
surfing term. But
So a rip is pulling you out towards the
Yes.
ocean. Okay.
So if I'm stuck in a rip or a current
Yeah.
off the ocean, off the beach, me worrying about what I'm going to be eating that night or what I'm doing next week is
Not
literally
important.
a waste of time.
Totally.
My whole job right now is to keep my head above water. That's all I'm focused on. So that's sometimes I always use that as an analogy just to keep in mind. And that's that survival mindset.
That is so good. Oh, that's amazing. It makes so much sense. I'm not worried about what I'm doing tomorrow, what clothes I'm going to wear. I'm just worried about getting out of the ocean alive.
I've just got to stay ahead. All I can do right now is keep my head above water.
Wow. Yeah, huge.
And obviously with grief, that's like when we have big traumatic grief, that's the body's going to have that playing into the for definite, and it's there to help you.
Wow. Oh. M here asked, why does anticipatory grief feel almost worse than actual grief?
Look, that's a great question, and it's funny. It's even just in preparing for this, I think one of the things I was just reflecting on quite often, like I think one of your sort of questions you sent through was just looking at the ideas of how do I see grief impacting clients in different spaces, and obviously there's the depressive symptoms we've spoken about, but quite often when I look at the anxiety and that kind of stuff, it's often a fear of what I could lose.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got that sort of, which is ultimately still fear of grief.
Yeah.
It's a fear of a future grief. But when you've still what I could lose, but at the same time, it's also the other part that mixes with that is the unknown.
Mm.
So you've got two of them playing at the same time in that space.
Sure. Yeah. So, and often, cancer is an example of
Yes.
that. We're seeing somebody, we don't know that timeline. Doctors tell us 6 months, we get 12 months,
Yeah.
or the opposite way around.
Yeah, and I can sort of that context, that's probably something that's a really good point you raised there, because one of the things to keep in mind, as I'm saying with this process, the whole idea with grief is trying to come to terms with or accept the loss of someone or something that I love and the future. The hard part when we're going through like someone with terminal cancer or long-term sort of diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
that gets in the way and messes up the grief process. Because basically before they pass, we're sitting in a mixture of grief and hope at the same time.
It's a dichotomy.
It's a dichotomy. Whereas, like, and this is there's no right way with grief, but the difference when I lose someone suddenly, I don't have to play with it.
That's right.
The acceptance of the loss of the hope
That's right.
is a bit more of a natural process.
Yeah.
Whereas, so it's because that always is something, like when I work with clients, it's always something we work through. It's going to change the nature of this because it brings up other emotions. Because sometimes people often describe when they do pass, it's like almost like, especially if they watch someone they love in pain, and it's like then it brings up these other emotions of almost like guilt and relief and selfishness, and so it brings it. But it's because that process has basically been a bit messed around with the dichotomy.
And Kaylee and I are the example of that. So Dad died suddenly, tragically. Her mum passed over 7 years with cancer. And so we've both got these stories. And I've had people over the years, I've had people say to me, man, I'm so sorry for your loss. Like, I can't imagine that must have been so much worse than my dad dying of cancer. But then here I am saying, and there's no comparison, but I haven't had to sit and watch my dad suffer over years,
Yes.
And so you cannot tie a bow around it and say this one here is worse than this one, or they're just different.
Well, it's funny. Like one of my things is, it's like I always go, it's like Aldi, the shopping store here. It's not good. It's just different.
Aldi. Hey, we like Aldi.
I go there.
Yes.
But it's exactly that.
Different.
It's different. It's not. It's everyone. It's just a totally different thing, and it's a different process that you go through in that.
I knew there'd be analogies and metaphors on this episode. I did not know we'd go to Aldi and supermarkets, but here we are. Hey, this has been so powerful. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that maybe I should have, or that you would have liked to share?
Nothing I can think of at the moment. I think like the biggest thing, which we sort of touched on just at the end, is just recognizing that a central part of grief is the idea of acceptance. And it's one of the most difficult things as humans that we have to do. Because this kind of acceptance is not the acceptance of, accept I'm a good. This is having to accept something that I don't want to accept.
Totally.
And that's one of the most difficult aspects that as humans we have to deal with. We're just not wired very well for that.
Man. We'll keep working on that. This has been great. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for sharing all your wisdom and knowledge.
Thanks for having me. It's been great catching up again. Yeah.
And I think we should do it again sometime. And we're going to be fortunate enough to have you sharing inside of our Good Grief Club on some of these ideas a little bit more specifically. So we're looking forward to having you on that. But we just wanted to say thank you for listening. If you found this valuable, I'd ask two things. One, share it with somebody else that is going through grief, or maybe they're supporting you so they can understand it as well. But two, if you found this episode valuable, would you please rate and review the podcast? That would mean the world to us. Also show Shaun that his time here was well spent, and also help reach other people. And until next episode, big love from myself, from Kaylee, who's looking after baby Nazare right now, and Shaun as well. Ciao.